Hello everybody, we're going to do the memory review for the test coming up on either Monday or Tuesday. It'll be pretty straightforward, kind of what you're really used to now. There'll be 22 multiple choice worth 1 point, an FRQ 7 points on it worth 28 points. I'm telling you right now that I'm going to throw some other words on there, so have your other review sheets and maybe your other notes and things handy so you can go back and not only define those terms but also apply them to the scenario. So let's just start with the mental processes of memory. It's either through encoding, which is getting that information in, storage, which is the retention of that memory, or the retrieval, getting that information out. And when we talk about memory, remember, these are the types of memory, really. So we can think of that memory model as the sensory memory is that encoding. The storage is really the kind of the short term to get it into long term. And then the retrieval is, once it's in long term, how do you get it back out? And one way that we kind of continue to do this constantly is through parallel processing, our ability to process several pieces of information at once. When we are actually doing parallel processing, we're doing these mental processes, all of these mental processes using all types of memory at the entire time. And so to keep in mind that parallel processing doesn't just include one type of mental processing or type of memory. So let's start with the basics. Sensory memory. That's our shortest, most brief memory. This is the sensation, right, that we bring into our bodies. I want you to know two. I want you to know echoic, which is auditory information. We hold it in our memory about 2 to 3 seconds. Or iconic, that's visual memory, and that's about 1 second, which makes a lot of sense as to why one is a little bit longer than the other, but also as to why we can, if we don't pay attention to it, we can't hold it in our memories any longer than that, because, well, our brains would be just too much. There would be no other processing that would happen because there would be too much information in there. Once we have it in sensory memory, we have to pay attention to it. That then sends us to short-term memory. This is our activated memory that's about 10 to 30 seconds. I keep stressing this 10 to 30 seconds because anything more than that is probably really truly not your short-term memory. What more likely it is our working memory. This is a better and more alternative model of short-term memory, which processes the visual and auditory information from short-term memory to long-term memory. Now, what I want you to kind of really key in there is much like the short-term memory, it's activated. We have to work with it. If you pay attention to something, but it only stays in your memory for 30 seconds, well, then it's really not going to get to your long-term memory. So you have to work at it. You have to practice. You have to add deep processing and really attach some meaning. So you can improve your working memory with spacing techniques, and we'll talk about that here in a second, with active learning. And what I mean by active learning is like quizzing yourself, doing practice test questions. That's all working memory to get it to long-term memory, and then actually to get it out of long-term memory. All of these effects. The capacity of our short-term memory is about 7 items. You know, we say the magic number 7. It's really plus or minus 2. 5 to 9 is the range, but the capacity is about 7 items. Any more than that, you're probably going to have to use a mnemonic device to keep it in short-term memory and work with it in working memory. This is how we increase the capacity of our short-term memory, or even you could say long-term memory, of working memory, of increasing the capacity of our short-term or working memory of 7 items through encoding techniques. Now remember, encoding is getting that information in. So mnemonic devices are things like songs, which I think are absolutely fantastic ways to remember things, rhymes, acronyms, chunking. These are all really good ways to get that information in. The serial position effect tells us that it's easier to recall the first items in a list. That's called the primacy effect. Or the last items in a list. That's called the recency effect. But it's more difficult to recall the middle. So if I would ask you, say, the first 5 presidents, I bet you could probably name them. If I asked you the last 5 presidents, you could maybe name them. If I asked you who presidents 21 through 27 are, that might take some time for you once again to learn. Can you learn it? Of course. Can you encode it into your memory? I used to be easily able to recall the presidents in order. I haven't worked with it lately. Now that I'm teaching U.S. history, I have to work with it more, but sometimes those ones in the middle get a little bit fuzzy, even for history teachers. Please add this one other thing. In short-term memory, I want you to put it in between short-term memory and long-term memory. Please add one more item. It's on distributive practice. And what I want you to understand is distributive practice allows that active processing. So remember where I talked about working memory, that active learning? We can improve our working memory to get into long-term memory through distributive practice. And that's essentially spacing out your studying your notes a little bit each day rather than massed practice, which is, in other words, cramming. So distributive practice or distributive study is a much better method of transferring information from short-term or working memory, more obviously, to long-term memory. So please make sure you add distributive practice somewhere there. Long-term memory. This is our relatively, I say relatively permanent memory. I also said it's kind of limitless. We have a huge capacity for memory, and mostly it is permanent, although memories can definitely fade or dull. I crossed off semantic there because I put it under explicit. So let's just talk about explicit memory. This explicit memory is something that takes our conscious effort. However, it's easy to explain. You can easily tell me about a memory. You can explain what happened or who was there or whatever it might be. It takes a little conscious effort. Like, you might have to stop and think about it, but it's easy to put into words. Semantic memory and episodic memory, these are both types of explicit long-term memory. Semantic is more like facts and knowledge of things. I think I asked somebody like the colors of the rainbow or the capitals or whatever it might be. Episodic memory is how we remember long-term memories in an order or a sequence. We actually kind of order it in our mind in sequential order, in a kind of episodic order. Think of it just like in television, where you'd watch one episode and then you'd watch the next episode to make sense of what had happened before. Implicit memory is another type of long-term memory, and this is the retention of memory or skills, and this is more automatic and unconscious. Like, you don't think about it, and even when you do think about it, it's hard to describe in words. So procedural memory is a type of implicit memory, and this is just our memory of skills. I could ask you, how do you ride a bike? And you'd be like, well, you get on and you balance and then you pedal and then you just go forward. Well, that's actually quite hard to describe in words, but I can picture myself, I can remember how to ride a bike. Even in my mind, I can see myself riding a bike and how to ride a bike. That's procedural, implicit memory. Flashbulb memories. When I had you read Lost in the Mall, she didn't specifically mention it, but Elizabeth Loftus was essentially talking about flashbulb memories. These are emotionally significant memories. Now, whichever side of the Loftus argument you fall on, we do know that flashbulb memories are rarely ever forgotten, but they might be inaccurate. And what I realize with that, which is the part that I understand with Elizabeth Loftus is that we kind of have to fill in the gaps. In order for us to process it in our minds and make sense of it, we have to make up a story. We have to make up a narrative. Now, we're not making up this kind of story to trick people or even to trick ourselves, but to simply make sense of it. And so really what we know is it's probably never forgotten, but it might be repressed, and then it tends to be inaccurate if it has been repressed because it's too painful of an experience to think about, or whatever that might be. So do know that flashbulb memories are a really big deal, except they might not, everybody has their own flashbulb memory, and they might not be exactly the same. The forgetting curve. In this chapter we've talked about Ebbinghaus a couple of different times. He talked about the forgetting curve, that memory declines rapidly when there is no attempt to retain it. Then it remains fairly level over time. So it takes just that deep, steep nosedive, and then it kind of levels off over time, and you'll retain, as long as it had been in your long-term memory, you'll probably retain between 30 and 40% of the original information or original memories that you had. This is more explicit memory. We're not talking implicit here. We're talking explicit long-term memory. Long-term potentiation. This is an increase in the synaptic firings that affects memory processing. So when I say, this is a big old fancy word, we're really talking about long-term potentiation at the neural level. We're talking about in the basal ganglia, right below the cortex, where this is happening. So this synaptic change essentially means we're learning. If you think of last chapter, what learning meant, we see that this increase in synaptic firings is learning, which means then we can remember it. And so long-term potentiation and learning go really hand in hand at the biological level, or from a biological perspective. A concept is a mental representation of a category. Now, that is also one of those okay, I don't know what that means. A mental representation of a category. So I'm going to say, let's think of a category of an animal. Let's think of another category, maybe let's say a bird, or let's say a car, or another category such as a book, or whatever it might be. When we think of a prototype, we think of a specific or typical example of that concept. So we're going kind of up a level, maybe you could say, or actually more down a level to be more specific, less broad. I always like to think of a prototype like Family Feud. Top 5 answers are on the board. What is the most popular type of bird? And they buzz in, and somebody says a robin, and somebody else says a blue jay. That's a prototype. So the category was the bird, and the prototype was the robin or the blue jay, or whatever kind of specific example that was. Constructed memory. Again, going back to the flashbulb memories and Elizabeth Loftus, we understand that in constructive memory, we might have false details, or we relate it to a time, place, or mood. So when we talk about constructed memory relating to time, place, or mood, sometimes we call it our state-dependent memory, or, and I didn't even write it down, state-dependent memory, or mood-congruent memory. So state-dependent memory is our state of consciousness, meaning what state of consciousness were we in. So, if you were in class and you remember me telling you about when I had a fever really bad one time when I was a kid, and almost the hallucinations I had because of that fever. But there's also a mood-congruent memory where, there was a happy event and you relate it to kind of a happy time, that mood that you were in. Constructed memory also can be influenced by others, means that people can influence not only your state of consciousness or your mood, but the memories that then come with them. And they might be kind of, constructed just the way Elizabeth Loftus did. that guy, I think his name was Chris, when he starts talking about, you remember in the story when he was describing that man, and he was like saying how he was bald and he had like a blue shirt or whatever. I mean, he was going into great detail, and that was not even like nobody had even planted that seed. And so it was very much a constructed memory, perhaps because Chris was highly suggestible and maybe perhaps for some other reasons. And finally, interference. On video, I am not going to give you the acronym, but you remember proactive interference and retroactive interference. Proactive interference is when the old information blocks the new information, and retroactive interference is when the new erases the old. It's always easiest to remember with that, with that acronym, how proactive interference is that the old blocks the new. The O comes before the new. The N. And so, when you think proactive interference, do you have an easier time like remembering your old locker number as compared to your new locker number, or is it easier to remember your new house number as compared to your old house number, or whatever it happens to be? So that was quick, that was short and sweet. 22 multiple choice, 1 FRQ with 7 points. Let me know if you have any questions. Talk to you later.